Was Karl Marx, when he was speaking, as turgid and obtuse as when he was writing? As he had predicted it would, why hadn't a communist revolution taken place by the time Marx died? Who the heck is Engels, Kautsky, and Bernstein? These and other questions will be answered right after this. I am Professor Jerome Arkenberg, and I've been teaching a wide variety of history courses across this country for the past 30 years. In this video, I'm going to tell you about Marxist dialectic materialism, Marxist ideals of the superstructure and substructure, Marxist religious, political, and economic alienation, Marx's 5 stages of history, his idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the socialist workers' paradise, and finally, Marxist Revisionism. Unfortunately, despite what many think, much of Karl Marx's ideological, economic, and philosophical thought is not all found in his book, The Communist Manifesto, but spread through a number of papers, articles, and books, with heavy use of economic and philosophical jargon buried in some of the most turgid prose you can imagine, which even the best translations can barely overcome. But in its essence, Marx's doctrine is fairly easy to understand, and in what follows, I'm going to lay it out for you. At the end, as usual, I'll have the wrap-up quote on this video, so make sure to stick around for this. But first, make sure to click like, share, especially subscribe, and that little bell thingy, so I can continue to bring you more great videos just like this one. The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, who was born in 1818 and died in 1883, argued that nothing could be gained from utopian socialism, since it was patently against the economic self-interest of the upper and middle classes. But it did not matter, because capitalism itself was doomed, and Marx claimed he had proved this rationally and scientifically. Marx asserted that society was inevitably, and he stressed it was inevitable, moving towards the creation of a rootless, alienated class of proto-revolutionary wage earners he called the Industrial Proletariat, which would inevitably spark a revolution that would lead to a new stage of existence, the socialist workers' paradise. Now, according to Marx, man seeks to produce what he needs for survival while seeking to exchange what he produces, which means that while we think that law, religion, politics, the arts, literature, science, etc., what Marx calls the ideological superstructure, that all these exist on their own, but in fact, everything we think or do is about money and survival, which is what he calls the economic substructure. You see this in this diagram here. This is the superstructure. So art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, education. And then, of course, it's a economic substructure, the means of production and the relations of production, with the ideological superstructure entirely determined by the economic substructure, meaning that every society's culture simply reflects the needs and desires of those who control the economy. For Marx, what causes discontent in any society, especially capitalist society, is alienation, religious, political, and economic, since it dehumanizes and alienates man from himself and his fellows. So in place of society, there is isolation. In place of generosity, greed. In place of cooperation, selfishness. We're all, as somebody might put it, islands in the stream, all alone. And that is caused by, especially, capitalism. According to Marx, building on the ideas of Ludwig Feuerbach, man is alienated religiously because, as he puts it, quote, man makes the gods do not make man. Religion is the opiate of the people, unquote. So man, to take his mind off his misery, projects an ideal of himself and calls it God. But this only serves to keep people quiet and in their place for the benefit of the ruling classes. So freedom can only be had if religion is destroyed. Man is also alienated politically, as Marx says, as the state is the means whereby the ruling classes legitimize their control of the people through law, religion, education, politics, government, and the police. So true freedom can only be had if the state is destroyed. Most importantly, according to Marx, man is alienated economically, since in capitalism, man is forced to sell his only possession, labor or work, to an employer who both profits from this labor and pays him as little as possible. So, again, true freedom can only be had if capitalism is destroyed and replaced by socialism, where, by Marx's definition, economic alienation cannot exist, since the product of man's labor will not belong to another, but to himself. Hegelian dialectic, put in place by Georg F.W. Hegel, seen here, built on the ideas of Plato, and asserted that humans solve problems, come up with ideas, and even order their daily lives along the line of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So, for example, as I often do with my students, thesis, I better study for my exam. Antithesis, I can really use a night out. Synthesis, well, I'll go out, but I'll come back in an hour and then study for my exam. So the synthesis now becomes a new thesis. I'll go out for an hour and come back. But then comes another antithesis. Things are so good, I will stay another hour, but I will then come back. And so forth. I will stay out, I'll come back at 10, and then I will come back. I'll come back at 2 a.m., I'll be sure. And then, of course, I'll just go to sleep now. So, according to Hegel, since history is simply made up of human beings, the progress of history, historical change, also follows this dialectic. So history is a story of an idea, the emergence of an opposite, or let's call it the anti-idea, followed by a synthesis of the two, which becomes then the new idea, repeating the cycle over and over and over again. Marx, who studied under Hegel, then asserted that he had turned Hegel, figuratively, on his head, and that while Hegelian dialectic is correct, this thesis, antithesis, and so forth, it is not about ideas but economics, or rather economic models that drive historical change. So societies start with a certain economic model. Example we have here, patricians versus plebeians, feudal lords, minerals, so forth. So a certain economic model, which is the thesis, over time a rival or new economic model arises, which is the antithesis. And after a struggle, which may include actual violence and warfare, a new economic model, a synthesis of the original and its rival, emerges and becomes dominant, which then become the new model or the new thesis. Got that? So, following this scheme, Marx said that all societies, and he does say all societies, go through 5 stages of existence, from one to the next, when new means of producing wealth emerge. For new ways, according to Marx, inevitably, as he defines it, cause tension, struggle, and revolution, as the old ruling classes are overturned by new classes who control new means of production. But there's a key concept here, which Lenin and Stalin and Mao and others, see the video on that, said didn't have to occur that way, but Marx says each stage must be gone through, must be endured, before any society can reach the socialist workers' paradise. So you can't simply skip from, let's say, stage 3 to stage 5 before you go through stage 4. Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, and Mao said you could. And look what happened to the Soviet Union and China. Now, as many historians before have pointed out, Marx's 5 stages of history resembles, in some ways, Judeo-Christian Millenarianism, which is not surprising given Marx's religious background. His parents were Jewish, but his parents converted to Lutheranism so his father could get a cushy civil service job. So Marx's first stage is man in the Garden of Eden, which is what you can kind of see here, the first stage, second stage, third, fourth, and fifth. His first stage is, for example, man in the Garden of Eden. And the first great change, which is what you see here, is the fall from grace and getting kicked out of the garden. That whole apple thing, you may remember. And then the other stages are man slowly progressing until the second coming, which for Marx is the second great change, after which is the end of time, paradise restored. The first stage, according to Marx, is that of man as forager in the state of nature, where all are equal and there is no property, as men exist communally. But at some point, the means of production are appropriated by some person or group, causing both the appearance of private property and the beginning of alienation, or the first great change. In the second stage, man is no longer able to work as he pleases, since his ability to create and produce is controlled by another. This is the stage of slavery. But flaws inevitably occur, a new means of production emerges, and revolution leads, as Marx says, to a new stage. The third stage is that of feudalism. In this third stage, again, feudalism, according to Marx, production is accomplished not by slaves, but by serfs in the countryside and journeyman apprentices in the towns, while alienation keeps increasing. But the emergence of a more efficient means of production leads again to revolution and a new stage of existence. This is what Marx calls the fourth or capitalist stage, as workers are displaced by machinery to form what he calls an industrial reserve army, the proletariat. The proletariat term, by the way, taken from the ancient Romans. Anyway, the proletariat, eager to work at any wage and to undercut each other in order to survive. And at this point, man's alienation and misery reaches its zenith, while all throughout all these stages, the number who control the economy, the owners, you might say, or as Marx would put them, the bourgeoisie, becomes smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and narrower. And at some point, when man's alienation reaches its zenith and the number of owning class is reduced to a small, teeny tiny number, and they both occur, that is, as we see here, the rise of monopolies and price wars and minimal pay in pursuit of profit, driving the proletariat into a revolution where workers seize power and expropriate the means of production for themselves. But this paradise cannot be achieved without, as Marx says, a dictatorship of the proletariat. This is an indefinite period where all political, religious, economic, sociocultural, and other groups opposed to the communal, propertyless lifestyle of the coming socialist workers' paradise will be destroyed. And increasingly, as time went on for Marx, increasingly he keeps on saying it must be by force if need be. At the end, it has to be by force. After which, the state will inevitably, as he puts it, inevitably wither away, as a classless, stateless society will emerge. So a kind of Soviet, North Korean, Chinese communist state with gulags and concentration camps and total force is not, according to Marx, the end result. That is not the socialist workers' paradise. At the most, it's the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which all of these areas, those who oppose it, will be either destroyed or, as a generation dies off and new ones take their place, who are educated differently, the entire mindset of people will change, so they only consider helping each other out and being a classless, stateless society will exist. As Marx put it, the socialist workers' paradise, that's stage 5, is the inevitable end result of history. For in this stage, man is no longer alienated from himself, as property no longer exists, and the fruits of man's labor belongs not to another but himself, as it was in stage 1. And this stage, unlike stage one, this stage, which harbors no flaws and contradictions, will hence be a final stage, which lasts forever. While Marx thought the Socialist Revolution was imminent, he thought it was imminent in 1848, but when it had not occurred by his death in 1883, some Marxists, some of his followers, began to question his facts and methods, revealing Marx's simplistic and Eurocentric understanding of history. So notice the 5 stages work really wonderfully well when you get to European history, but really don't know much at all, don't respond more of all to East Asia or South Asia or Africa or the Americas or anywhere else, really. And even his stages of history for Europe, as it turns out, as a more kind of scientific type of history, looking at actually legal records and real economic records that were unavailable to Marx, or a new interpretation which he was unaware of, again begin to reveal that much of his ideas of the 5 stages were also not terribly accurate. Plus, people had noted that the proletariat had achieved not just a better standard of living, but also a measure of real political power, which Marx said would never, ever happen, because according to him, the owning class, the bourgeoisie, would never allow the working classes, the proletariat, to have any kind of real power, any kind of power, political power, to effect change. This caused Marxism to split 3 ways. So Frederick Engels, the manufacturer's son, who supported Marx with money because Marx couldn't really earn his own living, and who actually put together a very short summary of Marx's thought. And then another guy from Germany called Karl Kautsky, and this is called Orthodox Marxism. A second strand is Edouard Bernstein's Evolutionary Socialism. And the third one is Vladimir Lenin's Communism. And for that, see the video on communism. Karl Kautsky, born in 1854, dies in 1938, upheld Marx's ideas at every turn, saying that though Marx may have been wrong about when the inevitable proletarian revolution would occur, Marx had nonetheless proved scientifically that capitalism was so flawed that its contradictions would inevitably lead to total collapse. Though how the proletarian revolution would, should, or could occur was never explicitly stated. In other words, again, as historians have pointed out, this is kind of like when Jesus dies and goes to heaven. The early apostles thought his return to earth, the second coming, was imminent. But as the years rolled by and the return had not yet occurred, some, St. Paul and others, began to say, well, it's inevitable of the second coming. Jesus will return. It's inevitable. Though we may have gotten the timeline a bit wrong. So in a sense, that's what Kautsky is saying in terms of Marx. So remember, with Marx, there's no actual religion. So Kautsky, when this socialist revolution will occur, we don't know. It's sometime in the future when the misery of the proletariat reaches its height and the amount of ownership gets smaller and smaller and smaller, though at the end of the 19th century with new inventions and technology, it actually widened out, but that's another story. But eventually, it will occur, the socialist revolution, because, of course, Marx had proved it scientifically. Edouard Bernstein, born 1850, died 1932, argued in a different way that since imminent revolution had not occurred, and the standards of living were in fact rising for all, which Marx said would never happen, and ownership was not being concentrated in fewer hands, as again Marx said, Marxism was thus so critically flawed that clearly revolution was not needed to achieve the socialist workers' paradise. Revolution in terms of a violent overthrow, like a French Revolution style. Instead, it could be had through evolutionary and gradual reform through democracy, which was working just fine and was, in the end, more certain than revolution, because with a revolution, it kind of goes in cycles and you never know what you're going to wind up with in the end, as the French Revolution had proved. This evolutionary socialism, as Bernstein called it, became the foundation of Europe's socialist parties, not England. Labour Party is not based on that, based on the Fabian socialism. But in Europe, on the continent, these socialist parties, in the end, this proved to be the most successful form of Marxism, achieving the socialist workers' paradise in Europe's cradle-to-grave welfare states. And here's the wrap-up quote. Communism is the positive supersession of private property as human self-estrangement, and hence the true appropriation of the human essence through and for man. It is the complete restoration of man to himself as a human being. Communism equals humanism. It is the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, and between man and man, between existence and being, between objectification and self-affirmation, between freedom and necessity, between individual and species. The entire movement of history is therefore both the actual act of creation of communism and the comprehended and known movement of its becoming. But in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch of activity he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another thing tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Karl Marx, 1846. Let me know what you think of this quote in the comment section below. Also, what you liked about this video, and what other historical topics or subjects you'd like to see in future videos. Be sure to click like, share, and especially subscribe, as it will help me bring you more great videos just like this one. And click on that little bell thingy so you'll know when the next History Waits for No One video is posted. If you want to know more, there are recommended studies in this topic in the description below, along with other ways to connect with me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the past.